Hello folks, welcome back. What you're looking at here is all the pieces that make up one Billet Labs monoblock. These are fresh off the CNC machine and they are dirty, they're fingerprinted, they're covered in old dried up coolant, and this video is just going to take you through the process of how we transform those parts into a finished, shiny Billet Labs monoblock. So most of what we're doing is sanding the parts and polishing them, but when the parts need to make a watertight seal, when they mate against the other parts, it's important to keep those surfaces flat. So we use a flat surface and some sandpaper here. We start at 320 grit and we're just lightly rubbing all those faces and just making sure that they are flat and that all the imperfections are removed. We work our way through various grades of sandpaper. We used 320 first and now we're up to 800. And that's just to make a nice consistent finish. So you can see here it's really nice and smooth. It's not shiny yet, that will come later. So we need to solder two pipes into this block here. So I'm cutting those to size using a pipe cutter. I then deburr them and I run them on the linishing wheel as well, and that just removes any overhangs of copper onto the inside of the pipe and just makes sure that there's nothing that's disrupting the flow of coolant through the pipe. Just make it as smooth as possible on the inside. We then clean the mating surfaces on the block as well, and we test fit the pipes just to check everything looks okay, and it looks great, so we're on to the soldering. We flux the holes first and we flux the pipe, put everything together, double check that the dimensions are correct before starting the soldering itself. So what we've learnt soldering these pieces is you can't just point the flame at the join and solder it like you can with pipes. The huge mass of copper underneath wicks away all the heat, so you end up just burning up your flux before the join itself ever gets hot enough. So what you need to do is to heat the block, and the heat will then conduct through the copper, and that's the only way that you can make the whole joint the correct temperature to solder with. And on the second join here, while it's definitely watertight, I've missed an area of solder over on the right, so I'm just adding a bit more there. That's purely a visual thing, because it looks much better when you have a solid line of solder around the whole joint rather than having one area missed, even though that doesn't affect the watertightness of it. So the soldering's done with the pipes into the block, but we need to add the fittings to the pipes. So once again, we just clean up the edges, clean up the mating faces, apply flux, put them together, wipe off the excess, and we solder it again. So heat from one side and solder from the other side, just to ensure you can seal all the way around. So that's the soldering done. As you can see, the whole block is now discoloured. There's solder spilled over the edges, and the only way to sort that all out is just a lot of manual sanding. So I'm using various grades of sandpaper, up to about 1000 grit in the end, just to remove all the solder overspill and just to resurface all those faces. And it's done, but it's not shiny enough. So we spend a bit of time polishing that up, and in the end it looks like this. So we've taken all the other pieces of the block itself, done exactly the same with them, sanded and polished those off camera, and it's time to assemble the block with all the nice polished pieces. So we put the jet plate in first and a paper gasket before adding the CPU cold plate to the bottom. And this needs to be a specific way round. If it's rotated 90 degrees, it will still fit, but it will block the entire flow of any coolant. So it needs to be this way round, so we're careful to get that correct. And we just torque up those bolts nicely. Then we'll take this assembly, put it to the side, and we will work on the graphics card end. So this is the cold plate for the graphics card. Because there's quite a few pieces to assemble here, we put the bolts through just to locate everything. And that allows us to more easily locate these paper gaskets for this section. So when they're all laid out, we put the bottom piece on top and slowly and laboriously screw in all of these 20 screws here, tightening from opposite sides in a star pattern just to ensure even pressure across the whole thing. And then we give each one a final crank as well, just to make sure it's tight. And then that's the two halves of the block separately assembled. So we just need to join them together to make one monoblock. And we do that with this gasket. Locate the piece on the bottom, turn it over, and just crank all those bolts nice and tight. So there we have it. That's the assembled block looking nice and shiny. But we're not done yet. We still have the motherboard bracket and the graphics card backplate to do. So onto the motherboard bracket. It's more of the same really. We're just sanding the faces smooth, making sure there's no scratches in them, making sure they're nice and flat and presentable. And then we're polishing those as well. And the assembly of the bracket. So we put 4 brass screws through, we apply a small amount of Loctite, and then we wind on our machined spacer nuts, which will hold the bracket at the right distance away from the motherboard. And even when that's assembled, the screw heads aren't shiny enough, so we're adding a bit more polish there just to make sure the sheen of the screws matches the rest of the bracket. And when it's done, again, it looks nice and shiny, just like the block. And then finally we move on to the graphics card backplate. And you know the drill by now, so it's just lots of sanding, lots of polishing, and just making it look as shiny and perfect as it can possibly be. And you can see the reflection in this. So here are all the parts laid out, looking lovely on the bench. And then to send it out, we just assemble everything into one solid block like this. Thanks so much for watching the finishing and assembly process of one of our blocks. I hope it's been enjoyable, and we will see you in the next video.